Right, Ian. So fracking, for the benefit of the people at home, I used to actually be a member of a political party. Fracking was on the manifesto, and it certainly divided opinion when I hit the doorstep. Some people said, wow, that's great. Some people were vehemently against fracking. So hopefully you're going to explain your perspective on fracking, because I know you've been very active in Yorkshire. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, well, fracking really came onto the scene in the UK in the latter days of the Labour administration. But it really took prominence once David Cameron took office in 2010. And literally in his first week in office, he appointed Lord John Browne, who was the former chairman and chief executive officer of BP. He appointed John Browne as his energy advisor. And Lord John Browne was very much pro-fracking. And of course, one would argue that this was somewhat of a vested interest, because he was also chairman of a company called Quadrilla, which will be very much in the frame currently, because of course Quadrilla are right now in Lancashire, just outside Blackpool, and they have submitted an application to frack the first horizontal well drilled in this country. And so that application is before Greg Clark, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, right now. Now, this country, of course, has been extracting oil and gas basically since the First World War, but in significant quantities since the late 1960s. And indeed, I mean, the country was actually self-sufficient in oil and gas really right through until the early 90s. And it's since then that our reserves have started to diminish. Now, the focus on fracking is due to a completely different type of target geology. Conventional hydrocarbons come from geology which gives up its resources without too much opposition. So, in other words, the rock strata has a natural permeability and a natural porosity. So when you sink a well into that geology and you open the well to that geology, there is a free flow of the hydrocarbon to the surface. It comes to the surface under natural pressure.
Right, let me just interrupt you there, because as my understanding of fracking, you sank a tube, a pipe in, and then you put fluid
Now,
down.
hang on a second. You're getting ahead of yourself.
Right, okay.
Okay. So conventional hydrocarbons don't need any further stimulation. Once you've opened the well, they free flow to the surface.
Right.
Unconventional geology is also known as tight geology. And that's a very good description, because it is very, very compact, and it holds the hydrocarbons, oil or gas, but it holds them and doesn't release them. So to get those hydrocarbons released, when you sink the well, you have to pump phenomenal volumes of fluids mixed with chemicals and a proppant, which is silica sand. It's a proppant. It keeps the fissures that are created open. And this is pumped into the geology at pressures anything from 5 to 25,000 pounds per square inch. And when we talk in volumes, we're talking an average in this country of 2 to 4 million gallons of frac fluid, which constitutes about 98% water, and it has to be fresh water. It cannot be brackish water. It cannot be pre-used water. It has to be fresh water. And that's primarily because if there's any contaminants in the water, then they have a negative impact on the process. There's about 2% that's is the chemical mix, and it can be a range of chemicals. In this country at the moment, the claim is that the chemicals that are going to be used are benign chemicals. And
you can drink it, can't you?
Well, that's the
what
claim.
I was told.
Yeah. Well, you know,
Would it make you ill?
It depends what you drink. I mean, look, when fracking was originally developed, the process was developed back in 1947 by a guy called George Mitchell. And he designed this process to recover an increased percentage of hydrocarbons from conventional geology. So he was literally pumping water and sand down. Okay, just water and sand. And it was only after he retired that basically the process was effectively hijacked and chemical mixes started to be added so that they could target the unconventional geology. And George Mitchell himself said if he'd have known that the process would evolve to the point of the level of toxicity that it has evolved now, he would never have allowed the process to be used in the first place. Now, unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago, at the age of, I think, about 97 or something. Obviously, a very, very wealthy man because he owned the rights to this process. But he was not happy the way the process had been effectively hijacked for unconventional hydrocarbon extraction. Because in the US, in fact, the data sheet of the chemicals that are used is available from one of my websites, frackingnightmare.com. And there's only one download on that website, and it's a spreadsheet, and it's the life's work of a lady by the name of Dr. Theo Colborn. Unfortunately, she also passed away a couple of years ago. But her legacy is to leave this spreadsheet, and this spreadsheet contains, I think it's something like about 960 chemicals that she identified as being used in the hydraulic fracturing process for unconventional hydrocarbons in the United States. And it's not just a list of chemicals, it goes into what they're used for in the fracking process, but it also discusses the negative impact, the negative environmental impact, the negative health impacts that are associated with those chemicals. And so whilst in the UK, the claim is, well, we're just using benign mixes at the moment. But what will happen is if the industry gets going, then eventually they'll say, well, you know what? If we just add this, then we can get an extra few percentage points of recovery. And then we add this, and then we add this, and that's called mission creep. So that, what starts off as benign ends up as something very, very different. And, you talk about one of the, about people claiming they can drink the frac fluid.
Yep.
Well, one of the people who actually made that claim is the governor of Colorado, Jerry Hickenlooper, who was funded into office by the oil and gas industry. And he made a statement a few years ago where he said, I don't know what the problem is with this frac fluid. We drink it before the start of every meeting. It's like a ritual we have. Well, he is absolutely on board with the global corporatist agenda. And his reward is that he's actually on the invitation list to the Bilderberger meeting that's happening in Italy.
I was going to say, it's this week, isn't it? I think it is.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So it's... the fracking side of things, I understood as well that visually it didn't really have so much of a negative impact on the landscape.
Oh, forget the vision. The visual impact, the visual aspect of this is a complete irrelevance.
Right.
Okay. First of all, the visual impact isn't as benign as is claimed. Because if this industry is going to contribute to the energy mix in the UK, the only way in which it can do so is to establish a network of well sites across particularly the north of England, the Bowland Shale, which stretches from the Lancashire coast right across the country to the Yorkshire coast. And ultimately, the potential is that the north of England ends up like the unconventional gas fields of the US or in southern Queensland in Australia, where there's a frac pad every kilometre or so. So, yeah, if you don't mind, 2.4 hectares of well site every kilometre, then I guess that might be constituted as not too much negative impact from a visual standpoint. I might beg to differ. But the real issue is what's going on underground. And
what about the water table?
Well, exactly. It's what's going on underground. Because bear in mind, what I said was that, if this is going to be an effective component of the energy mix, there has to be massive fracking right across the UK. One well site in Lancashire, one in Yorkshire, two in Nottinghamshire, and a couple in Derbyshire and South Yorkshire isn't going to cut it. That is just the start of things to come. If it gets kicked off, then the companies who are pushing to get this industry established would have a vision of literally there being a well site in every corner of their licensed area that they could possibly get to maximize the return. Because when you sink a well, now the Bowland Shale, as I said, sits right across the north of England. It's one of the most significant repositories of shale probably on the planet, not because of the area, but because of the thickness. So the Bowland Shale sits at an average depth of 5,000 feet. But and then beneath that, there's another average of 5,000 feet thickness. So this is a phenomenal repository, and could potentially, if it was so mined, last 50 plus years. But the devastation that would be caused in that time just doesn't even bear thinking about. So forget the well sites across the top of the country. I mean, that's bad enough in of itself. But let's have a look at what's going on potentially beneath the ground. And
are the government debating any of this?
Well, the government have basically said, we want it to go ahead. But and they've realised that communities are doing their own research and their own investigation, and that's why the communities are opposing it, and even Tory communities. I mean, this year hasn't gone particularly well for the Tories. There was a unanimous vote against iGas going back into an existing well at Ellesmere Port, and that's a Tory-held council, Chester and Cheshire West, and that was a unanimous vote against. In Derbyshire, which is a Tory council, INEOS have had an application to establish an exploratory well, and that was voted 9-1 against. And of course, we'll talk about it perhaps a bit later, but the attempt by Third Energy to frack an existing well at Kirby Misperton hasn't gone too well for them.
Now, is that the one that I saw? I was up in Yorkshire not so long ago, and I did notice you did appear on the TV quite a few times.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Was that
Kirby Misperton?
Kirby Misperton.
So obviously at the moment it's just a few well sites dotted across the north of England, so it doesn't appear to be too much of a threat. But this is just the start of things to come. But we go back to what goes on underground.
Yeah.
So when they're doing the exploratory stage, they'll drill a vertical well down to about 10,000 feet, about 3,000 meters. And of course,
which is still above the water table, generally.
No. They'd have to they will be drilling through the aquifers.
Right.
Okay, but that in and of itself isn't a major issue. I mean, there's over 2,000 onshore oil and gas wells that have been drilled since 1916, and some of them are still producing, and they're all conventional wells. So they've only been targeting conventional geology, and to the best of our knowledge, there hasn't been a problem in the UK with contamination from conventional wells. But this process is very, very different, primarily because of the enormous pressures that the fluids have to be pumped down into the geology to fracture the geology to allow the hydrocarbons to flow. So let's take a look at the process. They will drill the vertical well down to 10,000 feet to take core samples. What they will be doing then is they will be analysing the core samples taken from the lower 5,000 feet of that well. They'll be using the core samples to identify the pay zones, where they're going to get biggest bang for their buck by targeting. And then what they will...
Oh, so they don't take it all then? They just...
Well, they will take it all eventually, but they want to get the maximum return possible from the get-go. Right. So what they do is, it's 5,000 feet. They'll take all the core samples, they'll do the analysis, and then they'll identify where they think they can get the best return. And then what they'll do is they'll do some test fracks. And this is what Quadrilla are looking to do at Preston New Road. So they'll select 5 zones within the target area, and they'll run test fracks, probably 5 separate zones. Run the frac, see what flow rate they get, and then decide which area they're going to target for production purposes. When they do a production frac, that's 2 to 4 million gallons of fresh water mixed with the chemicals and with sand. It's considered to be an exceptional frac job if you get back about 40% of what you've pumped down the well. So where does the other 60% go? And that's a very good question, because nobody knows the answer to that.
Nobody?
Nobody.
Right.
Now,
okay.
you know, some years ago, it was put to the oil and gas industry that maybe if they put a benign dye with it, like fluorescein, which is a bright green,
They'd be able to find
you could track it. So that if you saw, you know, something leach out into a river or into a, you know, coming up in a spring some way away, then you would know that it's... So funnily enough, the industry has resisted adding any kind of tracer to the frac fluid for the last 30 years, because they don't want people to know. I mean, if it is leaching out, they don't want people to know. I mean, if you don't create the means to trace, then there's no evidence. And this is, unfortunately, the perverse thinking of the corporatocracy. So 40% of this stuff is recovered. That in of itself is toxic, because it's not only 40% of what was pumped down the hole, it's also bringing up the debris, which includes VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And just because they're natural doesn't mean to say they're safe. I mean, they're buried deep in the bowels of the earth, maybe for a reason. But now they're coming to the surface. So what comes to the surface has a degree of toxicity that at the moment we don't have a proven process to be able to deal with the toxicity of the flowback waste. So not only have you got massive volumes of this stuff being pumped underground that you don't know where it's going to go, you've also got the stuff coming back that you actually don't know how you're going to dispose of. So let's address both of these issues. The problem with the stuff that you're pumping underground is it's live. It's designed to do a job. It's designed to fracture the geology, to create artificial permeability and porosity for the trapped hydrocarbons. So it doesn't stop. It doesn't know boundaries. You know, you can't actually sort of program it to stop at the edge of the target geology. And I mean, there's an absurdity. You know, under EU law, it is illegal to frack in a way that would breach the adjoining geology. But you know,
how can you stop that?
Exactly. It doesn't. You know, fluids don't respond to political laws.
Legislation, yeah.
So of course, it just keeps doing what it's designed to do, and in the event that it reaches a more porous geology, then it'll just flow straight through that and potentially get into the water table. You know, and it might not happen immediately. It could take 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years before it reaches the water table, or it flows out into a spring or whatever. So, you know, this is a time bomb, and we're already seeing this in places like in the US and in Australia.
Did the US start it? Were they the founders of it?
Yeah, the US started the process of unconventional hydrocarbon exploitation. So, in fact, in the US, it's been going since 1996. There's over 1 million wells that have been fracked into unconventional geology in the US. And I mean, the magnitude of problems are such that even though the industry does everything it possibly can to cover up the problems, and of course Dick Cheney helped that with what's known as the Halliburton loophole, because Dick Cheney was, of course, the chairman of Halliburton before he became vice president to George W. Bush in 2001. And in 2006, Dick Cheney introduced legislation which effectively gave the oil and gas industry the equivalent of diplomatic immunity from having to report any contamination caused by the industry. So, you know, consequently, the problems that we do know about in the US, which are very, very significant, is really just the thin end of a very fat wedge. But I can state that in pretty much every location in the US that has been targeted for the exploitation of unconventional hydrocarbons, there are problems. There are problems in terms of negative impact on the ecology, and negative impact on livestock, and negative impact on humans. And in fact, it's the midwives in Vernal, Utah, who can be acknowledged as being the first to formally identify the impact that the industry had on pregnant women. And as is always the case, it's always the more vulnerable who suffer first. And, Vernal, Utah is not a big community.
No.
But the midwives there noticed that there was an increase, a marked increase in neonatal deaths, in low birth weights. And after some time, I think it was about 2011, 2012, they all got together to look at what had happened, what had changed in the area to cause this. And they were literally able to link this phenomena to the arrival of the unconventional hydrocarbons industry in their community. Now, Vernal's been producing conventional oil for a long time, and there had never been these problems. The problems only started to arise when the unconventional hydrocarbons industry rolled into town. And now, 5 years ago, when I was trying to raise awareness of this industry in the UK, the number of academic papers that I was able to refer to were quite few. Now, because of the focus on this industry, there's over 1,000 academic papers that have been written which cause, or should cause, governments and communities to be extremely concerned about the spread of this industry. But of course,
so these papers have not been suppressed then?
Well, you can. Have they been made freely available to the public? No. You have to know where to look. You have to go looking for them. But if you go looking for them, you will find them. But don't expect to find a list of these academic papers, published in the mainstream media. And the industry will do everything it possibly can to demonize and discredit the academics that have the audacity to challenge the oil and gas industry. And one such example of that is Professor David Smythe, who was formerly of, I believe it was either Strathclyde or Glasgow University, one of the two. Anyway, it was a Glasgow-based university. And he retired in 1998. But over the last 5-6 years, he has written a number of articles and papers challenging the sanity, basically, of introducing the unconventional gas industry into the UK. And he was targeted by academics that were on the payroll of the oil and gas industry. And they actually succeeded in getting his academic privileges withdrawn, even challenging his right to use the professional titles that he had. And he literally had to go to court to get those privileges reinstated. So that's the extent to which the industry, via its hired hands, i.e. academics that are receiving significant grants for doing the right things or saying the right things. But this is how, the dissenters are dealt with.
Well, that's why I was so amazed that you said there were about 1,000 papers, because normally the academics have to produce a report that fits the government's agenda.
Yep. And many of these papers are written by Professor Emeritus, i.e. they're retired. So they're no longer on the university payroll. They're no longer beholden to the Vice-Chancellor. And so, they have much greater freedom than academics that are still desperately trying to protect their chair.
So that puts into question that when political parties put fracking, for example, into their manifesto, they really need to consider these implications that you've been raising tonight. I mean, are all the political parties, do they all include fracking, or is it just...
No, the only two parties that are pro-fracking in the UK are the Tory party and UKIP. Every other party has stated that if they came to power, then they would immediately ban fracking. Now, fracking is banned in Scotland. Now, whether it's an out-and-out ban, or whether it's introducing planning restrictions that effectively make it impossible, it doesn't matter. I mean, Dallas, for example. Now, Dallas is obviously a city that was built on the back of the oil industry. And Dallas also sits right at the northeastern edge of the Barnett Shale, a massive shale play in the United States. And the fracking industry, of course, has milked the Barnett Shale, just as it has every other shale play in the US. But what was happening, they started outside Dallas and then they were creeping more and more towards Dallas, and then they started drilling and fracking wells inside the city limits. And the city council basically realized that, you know, this was causing problems to the residents of Dallas. But they didn't want to be seen to put an outright ban on it, because obviously it was very much dependent on revenues from the oil and gas industry. So what they did was they introduced a city ordinance which put an exclusion zone of 1,500 feet between any fracking well and a residential property, or any property that it was used for a public purpose, like a school or a library or a place of work. So that effectively was a ban on fracking inside the Dallas city limits. And by the way, I mean, that's something that North Yorkshire is also seeking to do with its minerals and waste plan, where it has put into that plan that there should be a 500-metre exclusion zone between any unconventional oil or gas well and any residential property.
Do you want to talk about your activism? Because we were using that word earlier and you said, oh, we don't want to talk about activism anymore.
Well, what I was saying was, put that in perspective, is that, you know, we actually have to get away from the exclusive vocabulary, because the word activist tends to be somewhat exclusive.
Well, yeah, I mean, Brexiteers used to call themselves activists.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think that we're in a situation now where people have to participate. And sadly, what's happened over the last, well, what is it, 50 years? Yeah, 50 years, since 1968. If we look at 1968 as the zenith, almost, of participation in the political process, and I am using that year because that was the year of the students' uprising in London, in Paris, in California, and that was the year that the globalists decided that they had to try to neuter student activism. And in fact, what they decided that they would do was not just neuter student activism, but to try and effectively shut down any kind of community activism. And they've done that very effectively, of course, by creating, really since since we came into the EU, funnily enough, but creating an economy where people just don't have the time to get involved in things that would otherwise be considered to be important. So we have a situation today where the vast majority of people don't have the time to participate, even if they have the inclination.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, thinking about that, because you remember the Greenham Common.
Yeah, 19 years, I think, there was Greenham Common.
You did tend to get a lot of women, didn't you, who would be on, but they're so busy now working.
Exactly. And students are so up to their eyeballs in debt that,
yes.
I mean, that's one of the reasons, I mean, we're going off a bit of a tangent here, but it's one of the reasons why, you know, we have phenomenal levels of depression amongst the student population. We have an increase in suicides amongst the student population. I mean, there are multiple factors at play here, but nonetheless, the economics are a contributory factor. You know, once upon a time, you know, being a student at college or university was the opportunity to bridge between being an adolescent youth and maturity and being a young adult. So that bridge from 18 to 21 gave you the opportunity to move out of the family home, go and study something that, you know, hopefully would set you on the path of a career. But even if it didn't, you know, it would take you out of the home environment, introduce you into a different environment, which was a combination of study and learning, you know, social skills, finding who you were. And then at 21, 22, you embarked on your career. And the first time that you actually were in hock to the system was when you reached that point where you decided you were going to get a mortgage, take out the death grip, and buy a house. Now,
those were the days.
Those were the days, yeah. No, and you chose. You chose when it was, and of course, most of the time it was when you decided it was time to get married or that you were going to have a family. And that was your prompt, as it was with me. You know, that was your prompt to go buy your first house. But now, of course, our youth are coming out of university saddled with massive debt. And, there's that pressure. And that's before they've even thought about, what they're going to do with their lives and thought about getting married and thought about a family. And of course, what it does do very effectively is that it prevents them, the majority of them, from participating in the political process. And so what's happened over the last 40, 50 years is that politicians have become less and less answerable to the electorate, because the electorate don't have the time, even if they have the inclination, to actually engage with them. And the politicians love it, because from a political perspective, it's like, once you're in office, once you've got the votes and you're in office, then you just want the electorate to leave you alone, so that you can get on with whatever it is that you're told to get on with by the party whip.
Well, we're finding now that MPs just stopping responding to their constituents.
Yeah, they don't care.
And of course, as people are having to leave, they defer their pensions later and later. They're also busy working. So there's only a really small proportion of the population now that have the time. And
this is, and unfortunately, that's probably not going to change anytime soon. So what we do have to try to encourage is those people who do have the time. And it's why, in a lot of cases, perhaps the most active community are the retirees, because perhaps the current generation of retirees may well be the last generation of retirees, period, because generations coming through may literally have to work until they drop. So what we at least have at the moment is a generation of retirees that are perhaps the last ones to have free time, because they have a degree of financial independence. And this is perhaps the...
they have the final pension schemes, final salary pension schemes.
They are the last ones with final salary pension schemes, etc. Exactly. These money purchase plans, which really aren't worth jack, it's not a pension. Basically, in the way in which the final salary benefit scheme was geared, you earned 1/40th of your salary as pension for each year you worked. So the theory being that when you retired after a career of 40 years, you had accrued a pension of 2/3 of your final salary.
I think it was a 60th, wasn't it? 40/60th.
40/60th.
2/3.
40/60th.
Yeah, I worked in the pensions industry.
Right, so two-thirds of your final salary. So 2/3 of your final salary, topped up with your state pension, meant that you actually retired on an income not too far
from what you've been receiving before.
And of course, in theory, most people who reached retirement had paid off their mortgage, so their outgoings were reduced, so they were able to maintain a lifestyle to which they had become accustomed.
Because it's all changed. And they're not even able to get on the housing ladder now.
Exactly.
So they'll be paying rent forever.
Yep.
So anyway, we were talking about the toxicity of the products being pulled out.
Right. So the only frack job that has been conducted in this country to date was at Priest Hall in Lancashire in 2011. And this was also done by Quadrilla. And Quadrilla fracked the well in March they first fracked the well in late March of 2011. And on the 1st of April, there was a seismic event, not significant in the scheme of seismic events. It wasn't tsunami inducing, but for the field, which is, relatively, it is geologically stable, it was a very unusual event. And it was 1.5 on the Richter scale. And anyway, it wasn't attributed to Quadrilla, but they kept on fracking. And as we now know, on the third stage of their frack, they damaged the well. They deformed the casing of the well.
Is that because of the pressure?
Yeah, because of the pressure. And even though they knew they had deformed the well, because they ran a caliper test, even though they knew they deformed the well, they continued to frack. And on May the 27th of 2011, a second seismic event occurred, which was 2.3 on the Richter scale. And even then, Quadrilla still went ahead with the initial test before they decided that perhaps it was the right thing, not to go ahead, even though they didn't admit that they were responsible for the seismic events. So it wasn't until some months later that it became very apparent that it was them. And in fact, I think in August of 2011, when the moratorium was put in place, they begrudgingly acknowledged that they were most likely responsible for those seismic events. And the moratorium was put in place from August 2011 until December 2012. Now, Ed Davey, who was the energy minister, Lib Dem, he was the energy minister at the time, and he actually wrote to Lord John Brown, who, you remember I said was David Cameron's energy advisor, but he was also chairman of Quadrilla. And he wrote to Lord John Brown castigating Quadrilla for their lack of professionalism, for the way in which they conducted this operation, for the fact that they had deemed it unnecessary to report. And Ed Davey actually questioned whether Quadrilla should continue to be the license holder, in that part of the country.
And what happened?
Well, he got fired.
Ed Davey did?
Yeah, Davey got fired. I mean, Lord John Brown just, went to have a word with David Cameron, and next thing, Ed Davey's out on his ear.
Oh, it was because of that, was it?
Yeah, absolutely, it was because of that. So, anyway, to come back to the waste, because there was 2 million gallons of waste that was generated as a result of those fracks back in 2011. Now, we had no experience of dealing with this waste in this country, so it went to the United Utilities treatment plant on the edge of Manchester. And United Utilities discovered that this was more toxic than they had expected. They did the best they could, and then they pumped 2 million gallons of liquid waste into the Manchester Ship Canal without any third-party oversight. Now, they treated it, like I said, as best they could, but we don't...
What do you mean as best they could?
Well, it wasn't to the required purity to be pumped into the Manchester Ship Canal. There
are fish there.
Well, the Manchester Ship Canal is regarded as one of the most toxic waterways in the country.
Right.
But, this certainly didn't
help matters.
And the solids that had been extracted from this waste were so toxic that they had no process to deal with them. And so they were sending them to other facilities around Europe, trying to find somebody who had a process that could deal with it.
They didn't go in the canal?
No, as far as we know. Okay, so where we're at today is we haven't had any further fracks. And obviously...
didn't we see some activism down on the south coast?
We've had the industry try to frack. They wanted to frack at Borkum. Quadrilla wanted to do a test frack at Borkum in 2013. So that was 8 months after the moratorium was lifted. But fortunately, the local community were well informed and were determined to stop it. Quadrilla only had a very narrow window of opportunity because their planning permission ran out on September the 28th of 2013. They didn't return to the site until July 27th. And thanks to the phenomenal response from people all over the country to support the local community, Quadrilla basically ran out of time. And so they had to leave the site not having completed the test frack that they wanted to do. After that, we went to Barton Moss in Manchester, where iGas wanted to drill an exploratory well with a view to fracking it. But the anti-fracking community established a camp on the edge of Barton Moss, which is just outside Earlham, between Earlham and Eccles in southwest Manchester. And the access to Barton Moss well site was actually via a footpath. And so once it was established in law that it was indeed a footpath, and therefore pedestrians have priority over vehicular traffic, then the reality is there's no possibility that iGas are going to be going back there anytime soon. After that, we went to Crawberry Hill, and Crawberry Hill was a company called Rathlin Energy, and Rathlin wanted to drill, they had two existing wells, one at West Newton, just to the north of Hull, and one at a place called Crawberry Hill, just outside Walkington, near Beverley. And they did actually attempt to frack the well at West Newton, but they damaged the well, or they lost control of the well during the pressurizing process. They had fire in the well, and ultimately they had to abandon the well, so that didn't get fracked. And the well at Crawberry Hill, a group of local people who called themselves the Jerry Activists, that should be a clue, average age about 72, all fine upstanding members of the local community. One was the former Director of Education and Children's Services for East Riding Council. There was a couple of teachers. Another one was the former leader of Hull City Council. Another one was a former NASA engineer. Anyway, they decided that every time a vehicle went into the Crawberry Hill well site, they were going to stand outside the gates and block it in. Well, because of who they were, Rathlin didn't want them arrested. The police didn't want them arrested. And so it was just a Mexican standoff. And in August, in fact, August the 12th, 2015, Rathlin Energy announced they were going to give up on Crawberry Hill and return the well site to its former agricultural glory.
So this work actually pays off.
You know, this is participation. This is the difference. I mean, you said activism, and some people would describe it as activism. You know, and I would describe it as participation. It's people actually taking an interest, what's going on in their community, and doing their own research, and then deciding that, you know, basically this oversteps the mark.
Well, I noticed I travelled through a village not so far from here, and every house in the front, they've got a placard saying, "No fracking in my backyard." So if everybody felt that way, where would they have to frack?
Well, and some would argue, you see, that's classic NIMBYism, and I don't care.
If it gets the required result.
It gets the result, you know, and
it gets attention, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the thing is that if it was a case of the only area that were being targeted in this country was a handful of areas. I mean, in the southeast, there are a handful of areas that are being targeted. And
probably because it's so built up now, though.
Well, Leith Hill is one in just outside Dorking. And it's really difficult to get people to participate in the south of England because people are too busy earning enough money to pay their outrageous mortgages. And that's why I've always said that when we stop this, and we will stop it, when we stop this, it'll be stopped in the north of England, and the south will benefit from the activities in the north. But fortunately, there are communities in the south who are really starting to participate in the process. And so, you know, the industry in the south of England is certainly not going to get a free ride.
Because we were saying earlier, off the record, talking about e-petitions, because as a Brexiteer, the number of e-petitions that have been circulated, and nothing happens with e-petitions.
Well, why are you not surprised? I mean, look, petitions and marches are very much a British social phenomena. And they have been engineered over the years to give people the impression that they are participating in the process, when nothing could be further from the truth.
And the government's just laughing.
Of course they are. I mean, let's just talk about petitions. If you want to see how ineffectual a petition really is, go to Downing Street and stand outside the gates of Downing Street any day of the week, Monday to Friday. And what you will see is somebody going through the gates every 15 minutes, because it's all, you know, you have to send your request that you want to hand in your petition. So you check in with the police at the gate, you go through security, and then you have 15 minutes where you can do what you want. You can have the press there, you can have your own film crews there, you get the publicity to say, we're here to hand in our petition for XYZ to Theresa May. And then the camera pans to the front door of number 10, and you go over to the door, you knock on the door, and a man comes out in a crisp white shirt and a nice tie, and he says, "Thank you very much. I'll make sure Mrs. May gets that immediately." And as soon as the door shut, it goes in the bin. You know, it's theatre.
Yes.
So petitions are pure theatre. Anybody who thinks that signing a petition is actually going to change anything has fallen for the social engineering of delusion.
That's what politics is all about.
Exactly. And that's why we have to re-educate people as to what participation really requires. And then we have the one-day protest. Protests tend to be in city centres on a weekend. Let's talk about a protest in London. Now, I will accept that they are good networking opportunities. It's a great opportunity for people to catch up.
Yep.
And, you know, it does sort of, you know, give an idea of how effective communication is around the country. But in the wider scheme of things, the protest march in of itself is meaningless. because at the weekends nobody's in London, certainly nobody's in Westminster. Everyone's gone back to their home or to their constituency. So who benefits from the one-day march in London? Well, the transport companies, because people obviously got to get to London. The police, because of all the overtime. Food and drinks vendors, because people need sustenance. And, whomever else may be necessary to facilitate that protest. And maybe if the police are lucky, they get some riot training as well. But in terms of bringing about change, I mean, look no further than the sort of million plus, arguably more, a lot more, who marched on Downing Street in 2003 to protest against Tony Blair's march to war on Iraq on the false premise of weapons of mass destruction. And it wasn't just London, of course. People marched all around the world to try and prevent what they knew was going to be an illegal war. And it changed nothing. So isn't it argued that one of the definitions of mental illness is to keep using the same behaviour over and over again and expecting a different result? Of course you're going to get the same result. So we have to be more creative. And one of the reasons that the anti-fracking community has been so effective is, first and foremost, that it has no structure. There is no hierarchy. There is no national anti-fracking organisation. It is a highly networked, loose-knit, non-existent structure of over 1,000 groups and individuals. I mean, I'm not part of any anti-fracking group. I operate absolutely as an individual. I mean, I go to support communities if they wish. If they don't wish, then that's fine too. So I go to support communities, I do my morning live stream broadcasts, I do the Fracking Nightmare shows, but I'm not beholden to anyone. I listen to people's counsel, obviously. I listen to, their concerns. And, if we see an opportunity that maybe, could be exploited to help raise awareness a little better, then, I'll support that. And when there's a need, like last week when I was in court in Manchester, I went to court in the hope that one of the local groups was going to mount a challenge to the injunction that Quadrilla were trying to put in place. But although
the injunction was to do what?
To try and prevent any kind of disruptive protest on the area outside the well site.
Right. Which have you actually started protesting outside?
Oh, it's been going on since January of last year.
Right.
And still going on. But
and they're getting pretty hacked off with this.
Yeah, they're getting a bit hacked off, especially when it looks like it's going to get ramped up. But, we do have in this country, we have the Human Rights Act of 1998, which is based on the European Human Rights Convention. And ingrained in that is the fundamental right to peaceful protest, the fundamental right to assembly, and the fundamental right to freedom of expression. And what's happening is that the corporations, of course, are desperately trying to shut that down, as it would be if the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership came into being.
TTIP. This was something that the Brexiteers used to focus on quite a bit before the referendum. We could see that it was a corporatist agenda, was the EU. It covered up, it masked a million sins from the corporations. Now, TTIP, they put to one side, but they actually promoted the Canadian, well, it's actually called the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. Our government, in their wisdom, know that people like myself and others know about the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, so they now conveniently call it the Canadian Super Deal or the Canadian Super Plus Deal, to mask the fact that actually it's TTIP in all but name.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And this is, basically, after the referendum, this shows the government's intentions, because after the referendum in June 2 years ago, by the September, the EU were putting the CETA on all the books in all the national parliaments, including our own government. Now, when I see people on Facebook saying, oh, let's have this Brexit MP in charge instead of Theresa May, I said, but hang on, this is the very MP that I addressed at a fringe meeting in Manchester in October, 2015, and said, look, hang on, you've accepted this CETA deal. What's going on? I thought we'd voted to leave. And there's, they don't expect anybody to study the parliamentary records, do they? Basically, they just leave the books open. 28 days passes, stamped.
Well, if you're allowed to look at it at all, because, the TTIP, the detail of the proposition was not even accessible by MEPs. And MEPs could ask to view the documentation, but to view it, they had to agree to leave outside their phone, not taking any pen and paper. They were not allowed to take notes. They could only go in and read.
That's right.
And then it was reliant on what they could remember. And let's understand, and we won't spend too much time on it, but the European Union is not democratic in any way, shape or form. An MEP actually has less legislative capability than a trade union representative in an organisation.
Yeah.
The European Parliament is purely consultative, but it's not even consultative, because basically what happens is it is up to the MEPs to keep track of what's going on, because it's the EU Commission that effectively establishes the legislation. And as we all know, it's not really the EU Commission, it's the lobbyists and the Eurocrats who then tell the EU commissioners, what to sign. And then it's up to the MEPs to try, or their staff, to try and find out what is in the process of being signed or what has been signed. And then, if they want to talk about it, to raise it in the European Parliament, by which time it's probably too late. It's a circus. Yeah. It's much more of a circus than even Westminster. But of course, then to put it in perspective, Westminster is totally subordinate to European law.
Yeah.
Okay, so whatever comes out from the EU commissioners, i.e. the lobbyists and the Eurocrats, and goes on to the EU statute books, whether it's actually signed into law or not, that then is the premise of UK law. So Westminster actually is a total charade at the moment. It has zero independence. Coming from the EU, the way in which they try to hide the fact that it is a dictatorship, basically, a corporate dictatorship, is that what comes out of the EU are the directives, and a mental block here. There's the directive, but basically the directive means that, we're going to let you go through the process of pretending that this is something that's emanating from your national parliament. And you've got 3 to 5 or maybe a few more years to actually get it through, depending on how controversial it's seen to be. And then you have basically the law, which basically says, okay, this is in place right now, and you need to stamp it. And consequently, we're in a situation right now where there's been 120,000 pieces of EU legislation emanate from Brussels since... And
it's still coming through.
Well, and 90,000 of them are not formally stamped into British law. Yet, we are still subordinate to that.
Well, we've just had the the data regulations, haven't we, that every organisation has just about had to comply with.
Yep.
So we're not leaving anytime soon.
No, exactly. And unfortunately, that will be the case until more people participate. So at the moment, obviously what's happening is all this circus of, we're going through all the negotiations. Is it going to be a hard exit, soft exit? How's this customs union going to work? Yeah, basically there will be no exit. No. And as I presented at AV7, just a few weeks before the referendum, I said, exactly what's going to happen. basically the result will be manipulated so that it will be a close call, but we will come out. I mean, actually, anecdotally, I believe that over 70% of people voted to leave the EU.
It was fudge, wasn't it? To make
Totally, but it was fudged to make it a close call, to leave open the possibility of another referendum. But in the meanwhile, the game plan would be to destroy the last vestiges of civil society in this country, to literally have people gagging to get back in because they believe that the EU was better than, basically what's on offer out. And what, unfortunately, anybody under the age of 50 has no recollection of is the fact that life prior to the EU was actually so much better. We had the nuclear family, which was respected. Women had the choice of whether they worked or not. And I will make no bones about it that, of the two families that I've had. But in both cases, it never entered my head that my wife would want to work over raising the family. For me, raising the family was extremely important. And I was extremely grateful that my wife and my subsequent partner were both very happy to take on that responsibility of being a full-time parent to my children. Now, that's not demeaning in any way, because I took the full responsibility for earning sufficient to be able to take care of the family. But
so difficult these days.
It's not possible.
It's not even possible with two salaries now, is it?
Exactly. So the reality is that the vast majority of young people today, that is not an option. My father, who is 90 this year, but he worked his entire life in a semi-skilled job, and that was enough. I never knew him to work overtime. I can only recall him ever working maybe a handful of Saturdays. We had a social life in the evening. I mean, he was also captain of the local boys' brigade, and of course he looked after the boys' brigade football team on a Saturday. And my mother had a social life in the evening as well, and so when she was out, he was obviously looking after the family in the evening. But on a single semi-skilled salary, he was able to buy the house, pay the mortgage. We were able to have 2 weeks holiday a year. Okay, not overseas, it was Clacton or Weston-super-Mare or somewhere, but we had the 2 weeks break every year. And whilst we didn't have a life of luxury, I don't actually recall being in a situation where we wanted for anything.
You had fields to play out in, didn't you?
Of course we did, absolutely.
Everybody had fields to play out in.
We used to, come home from school and go out and play until tea time. And then, you called in for your tea, and then you went back out and played again until sunset at this time of the year. Today, a young family does not have that luxury. And if a woman elects to be a full-time housewife, I mean, she's demeaned by the media.
That's right.
Made to feel as though she's not contributing to society. Meanwhile, we've got a situation where we're getting reports of kids going to start school at 5 years of age who can barely talk, and in some cases aren't even toilet trained.
I know.
Because when they're put out to a carer, does the carer take that responsibility for that training? When the parent is full-time working, things today are a lot tougher than they were pre-EU. And I can literally see that the slippery slope started basically, 79. I mean, let's say that the real changes for the worse started with Margaret Thatcher. I mean, they started with Ted Heath, obviously, in 72, when he effectively signed us into the EU.
You realise you're in the county where he lived.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, of course. That's why this is the county that also initiated the investigation into his paedophilia.
That's right, and that's why now the police commissioner
had to be moved
to Cleveland. Yes. You see, the government don't want the truth coming out.
No, of course not. No. On anything.
No.
On anything.
No, it's only just hit the headlines about Grenfell Tower, that how they're still finding bodies, but the government don't want that to come out.
Well, this is where the alternative media is so important.
I know, it's exciting, isn't it? For as long as we keep going.
Well, and you know, the alternative media has one important mantra, and that is, don't take our word for it.
Go and
Please
find out.
do your own research.
That's right.
You will never hear that said on the mainstream. You will never see that at the bottom of an article in the national press. You won't see a journalist saying, well, look, in the time I've had to do the research, this is my perspective as it stands right now. But, you know, as more information comes to light, then obviously maybe, you know, it might be slightly different. With the alternative media, you know, we report or we commentate on a situation based on information that is available, and we explain where that information has come from, and then we encourage people to do their own research and come to their own determination of their particular viewpoint. And by doing that, we're encouraging people to look at multiple sources. Whereas the lamestream, you know, their attitude is, no, don't look anywhere else. We are the font of all knowledge and all information, so everything you need to know is right here. And that should be your first clue that, you know, you need to run a mile. And that's exactly what the alternative media is providing, that opportunity for people to take responsibility for their worldview.
Well, I think the one thing we haven't covered was about the toxic products coming out, and you said that they had to travel to Europe.
Well, we don't know. I mean, at the moment, there is no known solution. And in fact, I mean, although there are, I think now 3, maybe 4 approved facilities to deal with frack waste, we still do not know exactly what that process is or where the treated product will end up. But, you know, so that's a big problem in of itself. But there's another problem that we've actually highlighted as well on the cusp of Quadrilla getting or seeking that permission to frack that well at Preston Road. Hydraulic fracturing, by definition, high pressure, high volume hydraulic fracturing, is not risk-free. And in fact, there have been numerous blowouts of wells in the US. Now, you can argue, and it's argued in this country, that, well, you know, the US doesn't have the regulatory controls that we do here. Now, that is tosh. The reality is that we don't have regulatory controls in this country. We hide behind palliative phrases such as, you know, we have gold standard regulation. Well, okay, can you explain to me where I can find that gold standard regulation? Oh, well, it's not all in one place, but we've got multiple agencies that are responsible for making sure that these companies adhere to gold standard regulation. Yeah, but can you tell me where I can actually look at this gold standard regulation? You know, it's a circular argument. And consequently, you know, after 5.5 years since the moratorium was lifted, I can tell you categorically that there is not any specific regulation in this country that applies to unconventional hydrocarbon abstraction.
Nothing's come from the EU.
No. Basically, I mean, there isn't any. I mean, the only. Or, okay, let me say there is one specific, and that is that evaporation pits are illegal. Evaporation pits is one of the ways in which the waste is disposed of in the US and Canada and Australia. You just pour it into a pit, and because particularly in the south of the US, you know, where you got and Australia, where you got the warmer climate, you just let it evaporate up into the atmosphere, and then you wonder why you get toxic rain. In the EU, evaporation pits are not permitted. So, okay, I will acknowledge that there is one piece of legislation, maybe. Now, we have another issue, and that is of emergency response plans. Now, for example, there's a subsidiary of Exxon called XTO. And XTO, and I'm just using this as one example, had 2 blowouts within 7 months of each other. One in August of last year, and a very, very significant one in Ohio on February the 15th of this year. the blowout was so significant that Wild Well Control, which is a very, very competent company that deals with blowouts, but it took Wild Well Control 3 weeks to cap this well. And it's estimated that over 1 million cubic feet of rogue toxic gas was emitted from that well per day over that 3-week period. Now, that's in Ohio. And a response plan was put in place. Immediately there was an exclusion zone established, a ground exclusion zone, an aerial exclusion zone. There were evacuation plans in place that were effected, for the few residents that lived within a 5-mile radius. In the UK, we have nothing. There is no emergency response plan in place. Now, how do we know this? Because a couple of participants have been focusing over the past few months on using the Freedom of Information request to establish what emergency response procedures are in place for the well at Preston New Road. And they're asking the questions of the Lancashire Fire Service, the police, the ambulance service, the local authority. I mean, obviously, Freedom of Information requests don't apply to private entities unless they are doing an activity that would previously have been done by a public authority. And that's how private companies get away with not being subjected to Freedom of Information requests. Anyway, the FOI requests that have been submitted on these issues, and the most significant one was asked after a whole round of obfuscation by Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service. And in the end, they were asked, do you have an emergency response plan for the Preston New Road well site of Quadrilla, yes or no? And the response was 15 pages of gobbledygook. So in other words, we can take that as a no. Now, within a mile of the Preston New Road well site is Kirkham Grammar School. Within a mile. Now, if there is a major blowout, a gas blowout, with potentially 1 million cubic feet of toxic gases, hydrogen sulfide, whatever, then there needs to be an emergency plan in place. The school needs to know what to do immediately. In the US, any school that is in that kind of close proximity has what's called a clean air room. Now, it might be the gymnasium, but this clean air room has doors that seal, and it has a filtration system that is state of the art. And basically, that's where all the students would pile in whilst, obviously, the problem is being dealt with. There will be a plan in place so that parents will know what to do in the event of an emergency. They'll know who to call, whether to come and pick up the children, whether to remain at home. The police will know whether to immediately implement a blockade of all roads. None of this is in place. And this I have put Greg Clark on notice.
Is he the local MP or is
No,
it
Greg Clark is the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It is he who has the responsibility for signing off on whether Quadrilla will get that permission to frack at Preston New Road. And I have put him and the Communities Minister, James Brockenshire, on notice that if they sign this application off, whilst there is no emergency response plan in place, it's another Grenfell Tower disaster just waiting to happen. And what would be the outcome? There'd be another inquiry and, lessons will be learned. Lessons have been learned. This is the stock phrase used by the establishment, when they're dealing with a disaster which was foreseeable and for which they are effectively culpable. And it's the same situation whether it's Aberfan, 1966, whether it's Hillsborough, was it 89?
Why can't we hold these MPs responsible?
Well, because they hide.
Personally.
No, absolutely. And that's why, I have served notice that to Greg Clark and James Brockenshire that they will be held personally accountable. And, and I made the statement in the live stream video that I put out. And I said, of course, it will be the end of your political careers, but it may be that you will lose your liberty because you have had ample warning that it is unsafe to grant this permission for this operation to go ahead when the basics of an emergency response plan not in place. And I know the reason it's not in place, because they don't want to talk about an emergency response plan, because if they start talking about an emergency response plan, then it will flag up to the local community that there's actually something pretty seriously hazardous about this industry.
You'll have your participants
exactly
there. Yeah. So, well, we've got it recorded today to those two MPs. They're on notice. What date did you actually give them notice?
That would be. I did it yesterday, actually, first thing. So that would be what was yesterday? That was Tuesday, the 5th of June.
So really, this would be a good idea for some of the audience, perhaps, if they take time out to write to these two MPs and also confirm what you've basically been saying. They need to have a plan in place in case something goes wrong.
And bear in mind that potentially 30% of the country sits above unconventional hydrocarbon bearing geology. And right now it's the north of England that's being targeted. You know, right across from the Lancashire coastline, right across to the Yorkshire coastline, all the way down the Pennines, down the eastern side of the Pennines, down into the Nottinghamshire area. And another aspect that we haven't touched on yet is that all of the areas that are being targeted for shale in the north of England, the shale sits beneath the old coal seams. And very recently, literally in the last 2.5 weeks, Professor Peter Stiles of Keele University has published a report questioning the sanity of actually fracking in geology that sits beneath the extensively mined coal seams right across that area of northern England.
Is he actually employed at the moment? Has he lost his job by...
Well, he's Professor Emeritus. Again, he's retired. You know, anybody who puts out a report that effectively challenges or is contrary to orthodoxy is either out of a job or they're retired. And they're obviously comfortable that they can do this without fear of retribution. Although David Smythe, of course, found that wasn't necessarily the case. And he spent... 5 years trying to get his academic privileges restored.
So how could that impact then, being underneath the coal seams?
Well, basically, if it bear in mind that the fracking operation in Priest Hall triggered the seismic events in 2011, and actually the Fylde Peninsula, there aren't any old coal workings. So that's why I said that the Fylde was actually regarded as being geologically stable. I mean, if we go to Ollerton, for example, in Nottinghamshire, Ollerton is the earthquake capital of the UK. If you look at the British Geological Survey website, you'll see that Ollerton, which is the centre of the Nottinghamshire coalfields, as they were, that is where, that is the community that suffers the most extensive seismic activity. Now, most of those tremors are relatively mild, but if you exacerbate the problem by pumping these fluids into the geology that's immediately beneath the coal seams, and you trigger some activity within that geology, then the likelihood is that it will reverberate and cause, at the very least, significant subsidence within the old coal workings.
Well, it seems to me, time and time again now, that our MPs are going down all these rabbit warrens, if you like, being so supportive of big business. They're getting themselves tied up into messes, which have huge implications for the rest of the population. You know, 5G, I interviewed Mark Steele a couple of weeks ago, and the health implications 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And it's like the government seem to be totally out of their depth. So I think it's about time that we removed our MPs, we brought in independent MPs and people who are not governed by big business, not supportive of the City of London in particular because they've got shares or investments there, not interested in big pharma because they've got shares. You know, we need MPs that actually care about the people. And I can't think of really hardly any MP that doesn't have any financial interest with big business.
I think that's probably the case. I have to say that I'm very impressed with the Conservative MP in North Derbyshire, Lee Rowley. I mean, he's brand new. And clearly at the moment, the party whips haven't found his Achilles heel, because he is still going against the party whip on unconventional gas exploitation. It'll be interesting to see how much longer that continues for. But look, we're not going to change this system overnight.
No.
And anyone who's looking for a quick fix, I mean, it could happen, of course. I mean, you know, miracles do happen. But the likelihood is slim, very, very slim. So we have to work on the premise of this is a long game. You know, it's not about revolution. You know, the issue for me, revolution simply means a sort of full turn of the wheel and back to where you started.
Yep.
You know, if we're going to have change, meaningful change that's, and I hate the word, but sustainable, then it is by definition most likely to be gradual. You know, it will be built on substance. And in the first instance, we have to get people to participate in the process. Now, we're never going to get 100% of people to participate. It doesn't need to be 100%. In fact, dare I say that 90% of people are effectively an irrelevance to the whole of the political arena, because they are never going to engage in the process. You know, provided they can get their daily update of
BBC.
BS, from the media, they'll just carry on cracking on, doing whatever they're doing, earning enough money, they think, to at least keep the bailiffs away.
So we need 10% of the population.
Well, 10% is to participate.
To some degree.
But even then, it's estimated in the War of Independence in the US that only 3% of people actually took up arms. And it's also estimated that only 8% of people actually wanted independence from Britain in the US anyway. But that 3% of people was enough to bring about the change that led ultimately, of course, to US independence. If we can work on the basis of building towards 3% of the British population that have sufficient commitment to participate in the process. And the motivation can be very, very different. I mean, one of the things that used to, annoy me a little was that, I could talk about all the negative ecological aspects of fracking. I could talk about all the negative health impacts of fracking, and people would sit there and go, well, that's terrible. That's really terrible. But then when I would talk about the impact on property prices, they would go, what? And that would get their attention. And I was like, well, hang on a second. I've just been talking about, the impact on ecology and health, which are, not insignificant. Yeah. And yet what got your attention was the potential impact on your asset base. And now, I mean, I'm like, well, okay, whatever it takes. It might be that it's the property issue that gets them motivated initially, and then they'll start to see the bigger picture.
That was like Brexit. People had different reasons for voting to leave. Some wanted sovereignty to take control back. Some didn't like the fact they were giving so much money away, and so on. So and immigration was another one. So it's what floats everybody's boat.
Exactly.
So you have to have an armoury.
Yeah.
5G is going to affect pretty much everybody.
Everybody. That's why I say the anti-fracking community is almost a nursery, because fracking only targets potentially 30% of the country. 5G is going to target everybody. So there has never been a more important time for people to participate in the process. And if they don't participate, then the legacy that they are going to be leaving future generations really doesn't bear thinking about.
Well, that's why we're here today, isn't it, Ian?
It is.
Well, Ian R. Crane, thank you so much for coming this evening. Is there anything you'd like to tell the audience before we cut the pay?
Well, I guess that I'm here because we first met at AV9 a few weeks ago.
We did.
And I'm pleased to say that AV9 went off without a hitch. And I've had a number of people asking me about the availability of the DVDs from that event. And I'm pleased to say that they will be available for distribution from the 1st of July. But people can pre-order, and they can pre-order the AV9 box set from the Alternative View website, which is www.alternativeview, all one word, .co.uk.
That's quite straightforward.
It is.
Thank you, Ian. My thanks to Ian R. Crane for coming to the Purple Summer Series. My name is Caroline Stevens. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.